we're from Dallas, so we have Good Records as our great vinyl shop. As far as like vinyl shops, let's start there. The whole rebirth of the vinyl community, I think, started with shops and the collections and all of that. What were the first vinyl places you guys visited that were your place?
If we're talking about personally, opposed to for the making of the movie, like personally, I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan, so I was fortunate enough to grow up in a college town, which meant everything pop culture related was geared to people who were, 18 to 22, which was fantastic if you were 11 like I was. And so I would take my bicycle down to campus, which was downtown where I grew up, and we had several. The local record store was a very famous record store in the history of Michigan music called School Kids Records, and there's a lot of like Michigan punk out there that songs like I Lost My Virginity at School Kids and shit like that. So which is super fun. And then we actually had a Tower Records in Ann Arbor for a period of time. We had a couple of local chains, but School Kids was probably the one that really sort of started me off on this path. And then many years later, when I became a vinyl person as an adult, I had older cousins who had grown up in Detroit, and they were already vinyl people, and they were like, okay, now that you're on Team Vinyl, you have to go to Encore Recordings in downtown Ann Arbor, which I'd never been to before, and I was like, sounds like good advice to me, and so Encore Recordings in Ann Arbor is my other go-to spot now.
Chris, you're Albuquerque, right?
Yeah, I'm in Albuquerque now. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, so right after college, while I was working a real job, I also worked at a record store, but that was in the late 90s, so we weren't selling records at the time. It was just all CDs. That was Rainbow Records in Wilmington, Delaware, and they still have the original location in Newark, Delaware still exists, so new owners, but I'm happy that it's still around. But yeah, in Albuquerque, Charlie's 33s and CDs is a place that I go to and go through their used records. I picked up In Excess Kick there, I remember, because it was up on the wall, and that was the first concert I went to when I was like 13 years old, so I was like, I gotta have that. But what's been really fun is, like, for this project, even though we couldn't do much record shopping when we were actually filming, as we've been able to go to cities and towns when we were doing like post, and now that we're kind of coming to hopefully the tail end of a pandemic or whatever, when we're able to travel more, it's great to just visit record stores in town. Like here we're in Wichita, so yesterday we went record shopping at Spectrum Music, and that's the best part about going to a record store in another town is you just don't know what's in the bins there, and it's going to be something different every town you go to, and so like you're passing up an opportunity maybe to find that thing you've always been looking for if you don't go to the local record store. So like in terms of like what's my favorite record store, it's probably like the last one I was in.
Well, the reason why I brought it up was because exactly what your film talks about. It's nationwide, it's small city, big city, it's anywhere where you can find that bin. So I'm curious, as far as getting to know the characters we meet, all ages, all varieties, how did you pick who you wanted to show us?
We were a degree of separation, or maybe two, from everybody who's in the movie. So they were all recommended to us by someone whom we trusted, which was helpful. And then we pre-interviewed them on the phone, and from that we could tell, like, does this person have something not only interesting but enthusiastic to say about records and music and the role they play in their lives? And some of that is fair, some of that is subject related, and some of it isn't. Like the simple truth is you need someone who is going to have some energy around the thing, or they're not a good interview. And so people we talked to who were quiet or retiring or had trouble expressing themselves, we couldn't use in our movie because there just wasn't enough there. Especially because, and Chris can get more into this, we had a movie that was a lot of talking heads, a lot of people sitting in chairs and talking, and we knew that was going to be really boring. It was going to be worse if we had people who weren't dynamic subjects, but we were already stacking the cards against ourselves because cinematically that's not very interesting. So we needed people who were dynamic, and then we needed to do more with the movie to raise the level of energy beyond that.
Yeah, and I think it became pretty obvious when we pre-interviewed people like who really did jump out at us. But and most of the subjects in the film, like I said, we knew who they were going to be before we interviewed interviewed them, but there were a few that we had like maybe just made contact with and we had never talked to them, and some of those are like the best people in the movie, which is really fortunate. And also like in our film there's a 12-year-old boy at the time, Elliot, and we did talk to him very briefly on the phone, but he was like a last-minute interview because we had one drop out, and you sent out a call for just, we didn't have like a kid drop out, we just had an opening. We realized we really wanted to have a young person in there, so sometimes we got really lucky, I would say, with the people that we found, even though we didn't know exactly what the ultimate story was going to be.
Adding that excitement, I think when you guys get a little bit into the making of the actual vinyl, the wax, everything about the table, can you guys talk about the technology jump into it? Because I think that little touch was the added needed to give the film a little bit of just a variance from just talking heads. I like that you're able to dive into the different elements of the entire analog movement.
Well, I'm a process junkie. Like, I like to see how things are made, and so I was the one, I think we knew we wanted to include the record presses because that's a big part of the resurgence, like how there aren't as many presses anymore and how they're starting to come back or new ones are opening up, and yet we still have bottlenecks. But back to what Kevin was saying about if you have a bunch of talking heads, you need to balance that somehow with the visuals, and so a pressing plant is going to be all visuals. So beyond just like how are records made, because I think that's really fascinating, and I think our audience would be fascinated too, especially because it's a technology that's been around for decades and decades and really hasn't changed. It's still really cool to see how that happens, and we're all still fascinated by these objects. But those pressing plants also, again, helped us tell the overall story that we wanted to tell with the resurgence. So for me, that was what I was drawn to. Is there anything about them, or in particular the process, like for you? Because I know I was the one that like, but yeah, we got to get in there. I want to see this.
It was really important to me, and I think to both of us, to remind people that records are physical objects, which was a big part of our rationale for making a documentary and not like writing a book together or doing a 10-part podcast series about the comeback of records. Records being real, tangible things that existed in the real world at a time when most music is kind of, as Stephen Thompson in our movie says, is on the wind, is ephemeral. We needed capturing that story, telling that story visually was the best justification we had for why making a movie was the right approach to it.
How did you guys go about picking the music in the film that we listened to? How much fun was that process for you guys? How difficult was it maybe to get some of the songs, but also knowing, like your book and stuff, like the knowledge of the music out there, trying to find those things that maybe other people haven't even heard or haven't even heard in a while?
I was pretty ignorant about the process of music supervision. I had like make 10 favorite songs that were about records, and I'm like, and we're gonna have all of them in this movie. And Chris was like, we don't have $300,000 to spend on music licensing. Nice try, but like that's not gonna happen. And so, but we were incredibly fortunate that Chris had worked with our composer Catherine Bostic on a previous project, and had a good relationship with her, and said she's fantastic, she's a great person to work with, and she's an amazing musician. She'll get what we're doing, and that was absolutely true. And then our music supervisor Morgan Rhodes, who is also in the movie as a person we interviewed, is so talented and has such great ears that she said to us, what are you looking for? And Chris, maybe you could finish this story, because the directions we gave her were C- at best. And she sort of nodded and said, sure, and took it all the way to the finish line.
Yeah, Kevin and I had this idea that the record is a metaphor for the past, the present, and the future. I mean, it's obviously something that was created in the past. It's pressed into this physical object, so you can listen to it now, and because it's this physical object, you're going to be able to pass it along into the future. So we essentially told Morgan that like that's sort of what we're looking for in terms of how the music should sound. It should sound like something that harkens back from the past, but it's like really current now, but it's not going to be dated, 10 years from now. Like Janelle Monáe was like an artist that popped into our heads that somebody we thought was doing something like that, but we're not looking for Janelle Monáe songs. But we also gave that note to our editors. So when they put in temp music. They found a Janelle Monáe track that they grabbed the instrumental for to kind of drop in to kind of set the mood for that. And so that helped both Catherine, our composer, and Morgan kind of figure that out. And of course, we had other temp music in there that editors put in to help us with cutting. But we told Morgan, it's like, listen, it's a low-budget documentary. We were smart enough to put a decent chunk of money into the budget for music, but it was not going to be for anything really recognizable. So he said, can you find music that fits that criteria, but it's also maybe up-and-coming artists? Because just like we want people to see how collecting records can be about discovery, like finding something you never knew that you wanted to own as like the next new thing. Like we wanted to introduce people to artists that they didn't know about, but also that we could afford as well, because it was always like really budget-minded. And I think there are only 1 or 2 tracks that we kind of strayed from the kind of the set budget for each one, because we wanted to find something that was special to us. Like the end credits track is something that we discovered along the process of making the film. It was a record that was physically handed to me by Karen Kelleher at Gold Rush Vinyl, one of the pressing plants we visited, because she said, do you want a record? I said, yes. She said, what are you into? I said, I'm not telling you. She puts Grizz's Ride Waves into my hands. I've never heard of Grizz. I take it home. I'm like absolutely blown away by this record. I couldn't stop listening to it for weeks, and so I made a strong push for, I'd really like to put one of these tracks in the film. End credits is probably the best use of something like this. And so ultimately we put the Escape from Grizz in the end tracks, and it's not exactly something maybe that's even of a piece with everything else, but it's something like this was introduced to me and to Kevin on the journey, and now we're handing it to you at the end of the film. So I just, metaphorically speaking, I thought that was nice.
How important is it that musicians have always kind of been into vinyl? I mean, I'm a big Pearl Jam fan. They've always put stuff out in vinyl, but even bands now, like I know Gorillaz just came out with a really special vinyl set. Black Keys always do vinyl. The musicians embrace it, thus the people that make their music embrace it. This revival has kind of changed back into just how important music is as a process of taking it home and listening, enjoying it. How important is it that the musicians really have dived back into this world and aren't just allowing it to just be thrown up on Spotify or anything like that? Like, musicians have embraced the vinyl movement just as much as the fans have.
I mean, really important. And we say this in the movie, and it's 100% true. It's far sexier to describe this as sort of an underground movement that rose up from the people, and the truth is, like, that's all true. Like, it was really a combination. Like, the comeback really began with independent record stores, music genres that never strayed away from vinyl, like punk, hip hop, and dance, and then musicians who were either who understood their fan base would always be into records. That's where the comeback begins, but it doesn't accelerate. It doesn't reach stratospheric levels until you have, as Billy Fields from Warner Music says in our movie, millions of people who want to buy those records, not thousands of people who want to buy those records. And so we can't say that, oh, well, Taylor Swift deciding to release 8 different versions of Taylor Swift Red had absolutely no effect on our appetite for vinyl. Like, Taylor Swift's fans, by and large, are not people who were present for the initial high point of vinyl, and yet are into it now because it's a way to physically possess that music for people who have not grown up with music as a thing you can physically possess. I think is there another part of that I'm missing?
Well, to your point, again, with the artists, like, I think they've recognized that their fans have realized, like, they don't fully connect with the music until they actually own it and hold it in their hands. I mean, it's not everyone, but again, to your point, Taylor Swift is a really good example of that, and so she puts a lot of energy and effort into her vinyl releases and makes them special, and she also understands how important the independent record stores are to that process, and she'll even do it with CDs too. Like, she sent a bunch of autographed CDs to record stores all over the country just to make sure that they had a collectible, essentially, that people people could go in and I feel like no one who bought those CDs opened them because they were autographed and they don't own CD players. It was purely for a collectible aspect. But they do understand that people are listening to their records. Some people collect them and just put them on the wall, but most people are listening to them. And I feel like my daughter's a great example. Like she listens to a wide variety of music, but she also listens to what's really popular. And I think like until she owns Olivia Rodrigo's Sour on vinyl, she probably doesn't feel the final connection with that album. So eventually she'll get it, I'm sure, and then it's like, okay, now it is complete. And when she really, really wants to listen to the album and she's not out and about, she's going to put it on her turntable to listen to it.
What is it about vinyl that sounds the way it sounds that makes it so connecting? Because there is something to putting on a record that's not presentable in any other form other than live music. Why is it the way it is? It's so interesting.
I want you to take this question because you like to talk about the five senses, and I think you put it well. So here, I'm going to give it to you.
Yeah, so the one thing we like to say is a record activates 4 of the 5 human senses. You can see it, you can touch it, you can hear it, and you can smell it. And your Spotify playlist you can only hear. Like, yeah, you can see it, but it's just words in green type. You know, it's not actually a representation of the music. It's just a list. And so we are almost physiologically going to have a deeper, more soulful response with a record as a thing, and then add to it a transmitter of music even more so. I think that you don't have a comeback as big as you've had with records without there being many, many reasons for why vinyl is as appealing as it is. I think and I want you to answer this too, I think one of the big ones for me is vinyl sort of envelops you in an ecosystem. It's not a club, much as a movie like High Fidelity would like you to believe it is, but that was 20 years ago. Like, High Fidelity was made before vinyl's come back, and that's very key. That's when vinyl was a small club that a few people belonged to. Now it's sort of a club that everybody belongs to. And the neat thing about that is you find yourself connected to people who you may have nothing in common with on its face, and you may not even listen to the same music. But I think we can say pretty definitively that everybody who likes records views the process of bringing records into their lives and talking about records and sharing their enthusiasm for records as part of being a record person. Like, you really don't, I'm sure they're out there, but you don't run into too many people who are like, my relationship with records is I place a bunch of orders on Discogs and they come in a box and I sit here in my underground bunker and listen to them and don't speak to anybody about them. I'm sure that person's out there, but the truth is that is not why records given up for dead 25 years ago are now suddenly, or I should 35 years ago, are now suddenly part of everybody's lives again. The reason is because records, and we hope this is what came through in our movie, the reason is because records are simply black plastic metaphors for human connection, and music being the language of human connection. I don't know, that's my favorite thing about it, is like you find yourself in a special club, but then you realize that the special club is everybody.
And I guess I would just add, kind of going back to your initial question, like the tactile experience of flipping through my records, actually seeing the cover art, you know, again, it's not the same as if we use Spotify. We should say, like, we listen to stuff on Spotify and we audition stuff on Spotify, but like if you really want it, we'll buy the record. But just flipping through it, like each time it kind of brings you a little bit of joy, even if you're like not even registering it. It's just like a happy feeling. And just taking it out and putting it on the turntable and dropping the needle, just that experience is something that's like joyful, but it's also comforting as well. And I like to listen to albums versus just individual songs, so it's a format that just lends itself to the way I like to listen to music. And yeah, something you have to actually pay attention to while you're doing it. Like, you're gonna have to get up and flip the record over, and so you're much more connected with what you're actually listening to. Like, if I'm gonna have an ongoing conversation, I typically don't put the record on because it's like I'm not gonna have the experience that I want. So yeah, there's a place and time for it, which makes it special.
let's talk about that happiness and jump back to the personal. I'd like to ask you guys, do you have a favorite pull from a searching in any vinyl shop you've been to? Is there, you brought up In Excess, but I'm curious, is there any finds you've had in your life that stand out to you, any records that mean the most to you? Instead of asking the High Fidelity top 5 records, but any stories you can share with us on a personal note.
Well, one that I like to share from our film experience is we filmed in Harlem. We interviewed this woman, Roz Lee, and while we were setting up in her apartment, she put on a record for us to just listen to as we were getting things ready. And Kevin noticed that all of us at one point in time went over to the turntable to check out what we were listening, because we didn't recognize what we were listening to, and it was BT Express's album Non-Stop. And somebody who didn't listen to disco, growing up, I didn't know what this was, but we were all like really enjoying this record. And so the next day we drove from New York down to Baltimore. We filmed at a record store, Hair's Breath Records in Fells Point. Sadly didn't make it through the pandemic. Thankfully the couple's doing just fine. And Kevin, after the interview, is flipping through the racks and he finds not one but 2 used copies of BT Express's Non-Stop in beautiful condition. Tells Cat Peach, the owner who we just interviewed, the story of how we discovered this record just yesterday, and he has to buy both of these copies for he and I, and for both of us. And Cat just says, they're yours. Like, thank you for coming to interview us, and just gave them to us as a gift. And so that's a really special record, and something I would never have found on my own, nor would I, if I had found it, would I have taken it out of the bin and bought it, because I hadn't listened to it. But that 2-day experience introduced me to something that's one of my favorite records in my collection.
Yeah, I mean, none of us are old enough to have, sort of been present during the heyday of BT Express, who were a disco funk band from Brooklyn. BT stands for Brooklyn Transit Express, and of 11 or 12, a big band, like 11 or 12 members. Roz is a native New Yorker, and that was the music of her childhood. But we were all drawn to it. Like Chris and I, who were in our 40s, Sherry, our cinematographer, who was in her 30s, our PA, who was 23, 24, and we're all like, what is this? And like, why is this so much fun? And that's, I mean, if she, I don't know this for sure, but if she had said, oh, this is BT Express, and pulled out our phone and showed it to us on Spotify that was being pumped through the stereos, I think we would have been like, oh, okay.
I wouldn't remember.
We would have forgotten it the moment we walked out the door. And something about this music from 50 years ago that was Roz's, the music that she had a personal experience with, but we did not. And somehow none of that mattered. Like it just all the divisions between time and genre and geography. I'm not from New York. Like the experience of a band so connected to a place like that, that doesn't mean anything to me. Like I think it just shows us what is special about records. Like that same day that we both acquired a copy of BT Express's Non-Stop for free, thanks to the generosity of Cat Peach, who's in our movie, there was a couple in that record store who were visiting Baltimore from Philadelphia that day. And like they had planned on spending 10 minutes in the record store to get out of the rain. And before they knew it, we get a little bit of them in the movie. They've got $200 worth of records in their arm. And I'm like, and I just started chatting with the husband of the couple, and I said, where are you guys from? And he goes, Philadelphia. And I said, oh, that's a great music town. And they're like, oh yeah. And like, I don't know what he said, and he's like, oh yeah, we got Dead Milkmen and Hall & Oates. And I was like, Philly Soul? And he goes, Philly Soul? I was like, yeah, Philly Soul. And he goes, I've heard of Philly Soul. I was like, cool. And he goes, but I don't know anything about it. I said, no? And he goes, no, like, what's Philly Soul? I was like, I'm no expert, but Philly Soul, as far as I know, is kind of the inheritor of Motown. Like, Philly Soul was black pop music in the 70s after Motown, but it was orchestrated in this incredibly, like, lush, complex way. And there's some great records produced by that. And he's like what? And I said, the Spinners pick of the litter. Spinners are from Detroit, but their producer Tom Bell was from Philly and was trained in that music scene. And he's like, where do I find that record? And I'm like, well, we're standing in a record store. So I was like, Kat, do you know where I could find Spinner's Pick of the Litter? And he's like, oh yeah, sure. And she found it. She pulled it out for me. Of course, the copy was fantastic because that's the kind of record store they ran. And he's like, I'm gonna get this. And I'm like, I don't know what sort of came over me. It was just one of those special moments that only happens in a record store. I was just like, no, I'm gonna get it for you. And I went ahead and I bought the guy Spinner's Pick of the Litter. He's a complete stranger. I never got the guy's name. I have no idea if he liked the record, if he took it home, listened to it once, and said, why did I come home with this? But those are the kind of special experiences that only happen in record stores. And the records I associate with those experiences are really like shining examples of like why we're into these things, why we made this movie, why it's just a really unique way to listen to music.
Well, I can say as someone who watched the movie and got that feel of itching to go to my record store and look through the bin, thank you for making this film, guys. Thank you for showing us all that's in it and all that's important to it, because I think Vinyl Nation does showcase exactly why there's something beautiful about vinyl, and not just putting a song on Spotify, but that analog style is hopefully never going to die. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Chris.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, Ben.